It was supposed to be just another uneventful drive, a simple detour to break up the monotony of the interstate. But that day, I found something that no map had ever shown me, a town that shouldn't exist. A place forgotten by time, hidden from the world. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I stumbled upon it, a discovery that would forever change the way I viewed reality. What I thought was a shortcut through the countryside became the gateway to a nightmare I could never escape. It started with an unmarked road, one that looked barely traveled. The kind of road you'd miss if you blinked at the wrong moment. It was curiosity that made me turn onto it, but it was something much darker that kept me from turning back. As I drove further down that dusty path, the trees closed in around me, and the modern world seemed to fall away. My cell signal dropped out, and with it, any connection to the familiar. The road twisted and turned, and before I knew it, I was lost in more ways than I could have imagined. And then I saw it. The town, nestled deep within the forest, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. But from the moment I set eyes on it, I knew something was terribly wrong. The road narrowed as I approached the town, the trees giving way to an open space that seemed untouched by time. The first thing I noticed was the absence of any sign, no name to indicate where I was or how I had arrived. The buildings were quaint, almost picturesque, with architecture that belonged to another era, brick storefronts, wooden houses with peeling paint, and a town square dominated by a tall clock tower. Yet, despite its charm, the town was eerily quiet. No cars, no people, not even the sound of birds or insects. It was as if the entire place had been frozen in a single moment, perfectly preserved but utterly lifeless. I parked my car at the edge of the square, hesitant to step out. But something compelled me forward, an inexplicable pull that urged me to explore. As I walked through the streets, the silence grew oppressive. Each footstep echoed off the walls of empty buildings, amplifying the unnatural stillness. The storefronts were filled with goods, clothes, tools, even food, all arranged neatly as if waiting for customers who would never arrive. Dust covered everything in a fine layer, evidence of years of neglect, yet nothing appeared decayed or damaged. The houses were the same, their windows offering glimpses of lives abruptly interrupted. Plates were set on dining tables, chairs were pulled out as if someone had just stood up. But there were no signs of life, no people, no pets, not even the smell of anything rotting or stale. It was as though everyone had simply vanished in an instant, leaving behind a perfectly preserved ghost town. At the center of it all stood the clock tower, its hands frozen at exactly 3:15. I found myself drawn to it, the only thing in the town that seemed to demand attention. But the closer I got, the heavier the air felt, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing, not just on someone's property, but on something sacred, something that didn't want to be disturbed. Despite the unease gnawing at the back of my mind, I continued to explore, hoping to find some clue about what had happened here. The first house I entered was eerily pristine. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was suffocating. It was a small house, with old-fashioned furniture and decor. A family photograph sat on the mantel, but the faces were blurred, as if they had been smeared by time itself. I moved deeper into the house, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The kitchen was immaculate, with dishes stacked neatly in the sink and a loaf of bread on the counter that looked fresh but was hard as stone when I touched it. It was as if time had stopped in this place, freezing everything in an eternal present. The most unsettling discovery came in the form of a diary I found on a bedside table in the master bedroom. The leather cover was cracked and worn, but the pages inside were crisp and legible. I began to read, and with each entry, a picture of the town's last days began to form. The diary belonged to a woman named Margaret. Her entries were ordinary at first, recounting daily life in the town, weather reports, notes about her husband and children, mentions of neighbors. But as I read further, the tone began to shift, growing more anxious, more fragmented. One of the earliest signs of trouble was an entry dated a few weeks before the final one. "Something strange is happening here. People are starting to talk about the fog. It rolls in at night, thick as soup, and when it does, the town feels different, quieter, darker. I don't like it. Henry says I'm being silly, but I know something's wrong. The fog was mentioned more and more frequently in subsequent entries. Margaret wrote about how it crept into their homes, how it muffled the sounds of the town until everything felt eerily still. People began to change, she said. Neighbors who had once been friendly became distant, their eyes vacant, their movements mechanical. I saw Mrs. Campbell today, but she didn't recognize me. She walked right past me, staring straight ahead as if I wasn't even there. And when I called out to her, she turned and looked at me, but her eyes, they weren't right. There was nothing behind them, just emptiness. As I read those words, a chill ran down my spine. I had felt that same emptiness in the town, the same suffocating silence. The final entries were the most disturbing of all. The fog is here again, thicker than ever. I can barely see the house across the street. Henry went out to check on the Petersons, but he hasn't come back. I'm scared. The children are scared. The whole town feels wrong. I don't know what's happening, but I feel like we're being watched. Like the town itself is alive, and it doesn't want us to leave. The last entry was dated the day the clock stopped at 3:15. It was only a single sentence, scribbled hastily across the page. They're here. We're not alone. I closed the diary, my hands trembling. The air in the house felt heavy, oppressive, as if whatever force had taken hold of the town was still lingering, watching me. I needed to leave, but as I turned to go, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing in the doorway. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. I rushed out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The town square was just as empty as before, but now the silence felt more threatening, as if something was lurking just out of sight. I glanced up at the clock tower, its hands still frozen at 3:15, and felt a shiver run down my spine. As I started back toward my car, I noticed the fog. It was creeping in from the edges of the town, thick and white, just as Margaret had described. Within minutes, it had swallowed the buildings, muffling sound and reducing visibility to just a few feet. I could barely see my car through the mist. Panic set in. I needed to get out of there, but the fog made it impossible to see where I was going. I stumbled through the thickening haze, feeling like I was being watched, like something was moving just beyond the edge of my vision. The whispers started then, faint at first, like the wind rustling through the trees. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. I tried to focus on finding my car, but the fog disoriented me. The town seemed to shift and change around me, the streets looping back on themselves in a confusing maze. No matter which direction I went, I found myself back in the town square, the clock tower looming above me, its hands stuck at that same dreadful time. And then, out of the fog, I saw them, figures, barely visible through the mist, standing just at the edge of my sight. They were motionless, watching me, their faces obscured by the thick fog. I called out, but they didn't respond. Instead, they began to move, slowly at first, then faster, closing in on me from all sides. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing eerily in the fog-shrouded silence. The figures pursued me, their movements unnaturally smooth, almost as if they were gliding through the mist. Every turn I made, every alley I ducked into, they followed, relentless and unyielding. Panic gripped me as I realized the town had become a maze, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Streets that should have led out of town looped back to the square, houses appeared where they shouldn't, and no matter how far I ran, I always ended up back in that same cursed place. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they were a cacophony of voices in my ears. Some were angry, others pleading, all of them overlapping in a dissonant chorus that threatened to overwhelm me. I could make out fragments of sentences. "Don't leave, stay with us, you're one of us now." But they made no sense, only adding to my growing sense of dread. I stumbled into an old gas station, its windows shattered, the pumps long dry. I crouched behind the counter, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing for a way out. The fog pressed against the glass, thick and white, obscuring everything outside. For a brief moment, the whispers faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that was almost worse. I needed to find a way to break this loop, to escape the town's grip. My car was useless now, lost in the fog, and I doubted it would start even if I found it. The town itself seemed to be working against me, trapping me in a nightmare from which there was no waking. But then I remembered something: the diary. Margaret had written about the fog, about the townspeople's strange behavior. If I could figure out what had happened to them, maybe I could find a way to escape their fate. I dug through the drawers behind the counter, searching for anything that might help. A map, a radio, a set of keys, anything. But all I found were old receipts, yellowed paper, and a dusty flashlight with dead batteries. Just as I was about to give up, I heard a noise behind me, a soft shuffling, like footsteps on broken glass. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to see one of those figures standing there, ready to drag me into the fog. But there was nothing. Just the open door, leading out into the fog-covered street. For a moment, I thought I was alone. But then I heard it, a faint, raspy breathing, coming from somewhere just outside the door. It was slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, was waiting for me to make a move. I felt trapped, paralyzed by fear and the overwhelming sense that I was being watched. The breathing grew louder, closer, until I could almost feel it on the back of my neck. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I had to make a decision, either confront whatever was out there or risk being cornered. Taking a deep breath, I tightened my grip on the flashlight and bolted from my hiding spot, sprinting into the fog with no clear direction in mind. As I ran through the thickening fog, the whispers and breathing seemed to follow me, closing in from all sides. My heart raced with every step, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. I knew that whatever was out there, it was playing with me, drawing me deeper into the town's twisted reality. Finally, I reached the edge of town, or what I thought was the edge. The fog parted just enough for me to see a sign. "Welcome to Elmsworth." I had circled back to where I started, the sign mocking me with its false promise of safety. But something was different this time. Just beyond the sign, I could see a figure standing in the road, barely visible through the fog. It was motionless, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't make out any details, just a vague outline, but I knew it was the same presence I had felt before. I was tired of running. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to let me leave. I needed to face it, to find out what it wanted from me. My hands trembled as I stepped forward, the flashlight beam flickering as I tried to focus on the figure. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaky but determined. "What do you want?" For a moment, there was no response. The figure just stood there, silent and unmoving. Then, slowly, it began to speak, not in words, but in the same whispers I had heard before. They surrounded me, filled my mind, twisting and warping until I could barely think. Images flashed through my head, faces of people I didn't recognize, places I had never been, and that damned clock tower, always at 3:15. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. They were trying to tell me something, to show me something, but I couldn't make sense of it. I screamed, clutching my head as the images and voices overwhelmed me. I could feel myself slipping away, losing my grip on reality. But just as I was about to give in, something clicked. The voices merged into a single thought, clear and sharp. "You belong here." The realization hit me like a cold wave. The town, the fog, the figures, they weren't trying to trap me. They were trying to keep me. This place was alive, aware, and it wanted me to stay, to become part of it. The people who had once lived here, the ones who had disappeared, they hadn't left. They had been absorbed into the town, their memories, their souls, all woven into its fabric. I was on the brink of becoming one of them, losing myself to the town's will. But I wasn't ready to give in. There had to be a way out, a way to break free from its grasp. The town fed on fear, on hopelessness, but maybe, just maybe, if I could find the strength to resist, I could escape. But how? The town had me surrounded, its whispers clawing at my mind, its fog suffocating me. I had to think, to find something, anything, that could disrupt the town's control over me. And then it came to me, the clock. Every time I had been in the town square, I had noticed the clock tower, its hands stuck at 3:15. That time was significant, I realized. It was the moment everything had stopped, the moment the town had become trapped in this endless loop. If I could somehow reset the clock, I might be able to break this cycle, to free myself, and maybe the others, from its grip. I didn't know if it would work, but it was the only chance I had. Gathering every ounce of strength I had left, I ran toward the town square, the whispers screaming in my ears, the fog swirling around me like a living thing. The clock tower loomed ahead, its face looming over the empty streets. The town square was deserted, an eerie silence hanging in the air. The clock tower stood tall, its hands frozen at 3:15. The closer I got, the heavier the atmosphere became, as if the town itself was trying to pull me back, to stop me from reaching my goal. I pushed forward, ignoring the whispers that clawed at my mind, the memories that weren't mine trying to take hold. The fog thickened, wrapping around me like tendrils, but I forced my way through, keeping my focus on the clock tower. When I reached the base, I found the door unlocked. It creaked open with a sound that sent chills down my spine, but I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside, finding myself in a narrow staircase spiraling upward into darkness. I climbed, each step feeling like a battle against the town's will. The whispers were louder here, almost deafening, but I blocked them out, focusing on the rhythm of my footsteps and the feel of the cold, rough stone under my fingers. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the top. The clock's mechanisms were exposed, ancient and rusted, yet still ticking with an unnatural energy. The hands were stuck, but the gears continued to grind, trying to push forward against some invisible force. I knew what I had to do. There was a lever, rusted and worn, next to the gears. It was jammed, but with all the strength I could muster, I pulled. The lever groaned in protest, resisting my efforts, but I didn't stop. I could feel the town pushing back, trying to stop me, but I kept pulling until, finally, it gave way. With a loud clang, the gears shuddered to life. The hands of the clock moved, inching forward past 3:15. As soon as they did, the town seemed to convulse, a shudder passing through the very ground beneath me. The fog outside the tower swirled violently, and for a moment, I feared I had made a terrible mistake. But then, the whispers began to fade. The oppressive weight lifted, and the fog started to thin, revealing the outlines of the buildings below. The town was changing, unraveling from the nightmare it had become. I watched as the clock's hands moved steadily forward, time resuming its natural course. The fog continued to dissipate, and with it, the figures that had haunted me. They dissolved into the air, leaving only faint echoes of their voices behind. I didn't know if they had found peace, if breaking the cycle had freed them, but I hoped it had. I hoped that, somehow, they had been released from the town's grip, allowed to move on from whatever had trapped them here. I descended the tower slowly, my legs shaky and weak. The town was still quiet, but it no longer felt hostile. The buildings, once twisted and distorted, were now just empty shells, remnants of a place that had long since lost its life. The sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting a pale light over the streets. I walked through the town one last time, feeling a strange sense of detachment. The fear, the panic, it all seemed like a distant memory, though I knew I would never forget what had happened here. When I reached the edge of town, the sign still stood, but the words, "Welcome to Elmsworth," had faded, as if the town itself was beginning to fade away. I didn't look back as I crossed the threshold, stepping onto the road that led away from the place that had almost claimed me. The drive home was a blur. The fog that had surrounded the town was gone, replaced by clear skies and the familiar landscape of the world I had almost forgotten. By the time I reached home, it was as if the entire experience had been a dream, a nightmare that had ended as suddenly as it had begun. But it wasn't a dream. I knew that. The memories were too vivid, the fear too real. I could still hear the whispers in the back of my mind, a faint echo of the voices that had tried to claim me. For weeks after, I avoided looking up anything about Elmsworth. I didn't want to know if the town still existed, if others had been drawn into its trap. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I searched for Elmsworth online, but there was nothing, no mention of the town, no records, not even a map showing where it had once been. It was as if the town had never existed, as if it had been wiped from existence along with everything that had happened there. But I knew better. I knew the town had been real, that it had tried to take me, just as it had taken so many others. And I knew that somewhere, out there, other towns like Elmsworth existed, waiting for their next victim. I still hear the whispers sometimes, in the dead of night when the world is quiet and still. I hear them in the wind, in the creak of old floorboards, in the static of a dead radio. They call to me, reminding me that the town is still out there, that it's not done with me yet. But I refuse to go back. I refuse to let it take me. I survived Elmsworth once, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep it from claiming me again. Because I know now that the town will never truly let go. It will always be waiting, lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. And I can only hope that I'm strong enough to resist its call when it comes for me again.